This is our second video exploring vClusters. In the first video, which you can find here or in the description, we introduced vClusters and built an internal developer platform using Backstage, Crossplane, GitHub Actions, ArgoCD, AWS, and vCluster. If you missed that video, make sure to watch that one first. But in today's video, we will take this a step further and allow our developers to request a vCluster that uses GKE from Google as the host cluster with GPUs enabled for machine learning workflows. So let's get started. What's new in this video that I added from the previous video is I created this new Kubernetes cluster with Crossplane template that is generic for whether you want to deploy EKS, GKE, or AKS. And this is all powered by Crossplane. So if you go ahead and choose that, you can choose your owner, the repository, and click next, and give a cluster a name, a size like we saw before, small, medium, large, and then Kubernetes version. I got 128 and 129. Minimum node count, 1, 2, or 3. And then the cloud provider, this is new where you can select AWS, Google, or Azure. From here, you can select that, review it, and that will go ahead and spin an application inside of ArgoCD like this one here. And you can see this is already healthy and synced. And this is going to get deployed via GitHub Actions that we saw before in the previous video. So all that hasn't changed except for, again, the ability to have multiple cloud providers for the Kubernetes distribution that you want. I haven't wired Azure yet. I haven't done anything with AKS yet. So EKS works and GKE work. At some point in the future, I'll probably add AKS. I just have it here as a placeholder. So once you have that, we've got our Kubernetes cluster here in GKE. You can see it's updating here. And the reason for that is that I don't have GPUs in US East 4B. I only have it in A and C. These are the three zones that I have. So I can see that there are the number of nodes are 2. You can select a different GPU type. I'm using NVIDIA L4, but you can search and look for other types that you'd like to use in other regions. I found it a bit difficult to get quota limits or increase the quota limits for GPUs with Google. I tried their online request form, got rejected, trying to talk to sales. So it's a little bit difficult, but if you have a relationship with Google's sales team, they can probably get you the quota upped up so you can go ahead and use whichever region you want with whichever GPUs that you desire. So if you look here at our GKE cluster, I can see here East 4A, C, and B is the issue where we don't have GPUs there. But if we look at the nodes, we've got 2 nodes up and running, which is great. And we just need one really just to show you this demo. And that's what we're going to work with right now. So now let's go ahead and access our GKE cluster. Let's do that through the gcloud command. So you can use this gcloud container command to access the cluster. We can also get that, of course, from the console itself. So if you go over here and click connect, it will give you the command directly. So let's paste that in our Visual Studio Code right here. And we can see our context has changed right now to our cluster that we want. And now we want to add this cluster into ArgoCD. So let's register it using this command here, ArgoCD cluster add. And then our context, which is right here. And then name, let's call it GKE host for GPUs. Click yes. That should create our cluster or register our cluster in ArgoCD. Perfect. Because what we want to do is now we want to give the option for developers to create a vCluster, a virtual cluster on top of GKE to be able to use the GPUs that we are exposing to them, okay? So In this case, we want to make a few changes. First of all, we want to run this command kubectl get service traffic, because we want to get the actual IP address of the load balancer that we have here from traffic. And this is the IP address that we want. And from here, we want to update that target domain that we saw in the previous video. It was an actual host name in EKS. In case of GKE, it gives us an IP address, so we're going to use that IP address in this case. So let's go ahead and update that in our GitHub Actions settings, under Settings, Actions under Secrets and Variables. And now we want to update the target domain with that IP address that we put in here. Perfect. So that is done. Now we also need to add some values to some of the variables in that vCluster Backstage template that we saw in the previous video, because now we're going to use it for creating a vCluster on top of GKE. What we need is to add the endpoint for our Kubernetes cluster inside our new vCluster template in Backstage. Here are the parameters that we'll need to update based on our situation. So we've got host EKS cluster name, host EKS URL for Argo. We don't need those. Host GKE cluster name, host GKE project name, GKE URL for Argo, and then AKS as well. We don't need that. So we're specifically interested in updating these three for GKE. So let's go ahead and pull that up. So if we go under Backstage, let's close this. If we go under Backstage, my Backstage app, packages, backend, templates, and here's our vCluster. And under template. So nothing new here. We saw this in the last video. We're just going to make some updates to our parameters that we see here that we're passing on to GitHub Actions. So nothing has changed. I made a few changes from the previous video, but just to accommodate for whether we're going to use EKS, AKS, or GKE. So you can see here the host cluster type to use. We're going to give that to the developer to choose which host cluster they're going to use to call on a vCluster. We'll see that in action in just a little bit. But let's make our change here under the GitHub action step here. And what we'll need to change, if you haven't done this already, make sure that this is correct for you in terms of your repository and the owner of the repository and the branch. Okay. And from here, what we need to change, as I mentioned before, the host GKE cluster name. Okay, that we need to change. The project name, I have that. That is correct. And then the GKE URL for Argo, that we also need to get. So we can get this from Argo pretty easily. So let's do that first. So if we go here, and if you go under settings, you'll see our clusters and GKE host for GPU. Here's our cluster. And this is really the endpoint for the API server. So we need that. So we can update this here. And then the host GKE cluster name that we have here, this one, you can get from multiple locations. And we have it right here as well. So it's called GKE host for GPUs. And update that. And that should do it. So let's go ahead and push this through Git. Cluster. Okay. Let's sync our changes. Okay, so now we need to register the vCluster template in Backstage. Let's go ahead and do that. So if you go back to home under template, you'll see that we have it here. So let's first unregister it because we made changes to it. So let's unregister this one. And then now let's create or register an existing component. And we need to get the URL for that. The easiest thing to do is to get it from GitHub directly. Give us the right URL. So we can go to under code. And once again, under Backstage. And go to my Backstage app, packages, backend, templates, vCluster template, and let's copy this URL and paste it in here. Analyze, import, and that's it. Let's go ahead and create our vCluster now. Go ahead and click on choose, put your owner name, give a repository name, click next. Let's give it a name for our cluster, app A vCluster, for example, with GPU, something like that. The host cluster type is GKE, and here you can add a description depending on your organization. If, for example, only GKE allows GPUs, or you're allowing GPUs only for the GKE cluster, put a description here that's helpful for your developers. Let's go ahead and click create. And what this is going to do, it's going to publish our new GitHub repo. It's going to trigger a GitHub action that's going to create an application in ArgoCD. And ArgoCD is going to spin up our vCluster for us. We're also registering this component in our catalog. So now we can see vCluster component in our catalog. And we can get the kubeconfig from Achilles here once everything is ready. ArgoCD will show as healthy once ArgoCD spins up the application. In the meantime, let's go ahead and take a look at our GitHub Actions. And here's our GitHub action deploying a vCluster. Let's take a look and see how far we've gone. So as you can see, we're logging into Achilles, and this allows us to store kubeconfig in Achilles, installing ArgoCD CLI, logging into ArgoCD, registering the repo in ArgoCD, getting DNS ready by registering this new app A vCluster gpu.tekken8.com. Of course, you have to change this for your domain, but this allows us to access the vCluster remotely. Then deploying vCluster, we use Helm for that, and then installing kubectl, authenticating with Google Cloud, setting up the Cloud SDK, and then saving our kubeconfig in Achilles. Looks like the job has completed successfully. That's great. And now we can go ahead and take a look at ArgoCD. And we can see that ArgoCD here created our app A vCluster GPU. This is another app that I was running 8 minutes ago, so we can go ahead and delete that. And that shows you how easy it is to delete a vCluster if you want. It's just all managed by ArgoCD, so it's pretty cool and simple. So this looks like it's synced already, and our vCluster has already been created. So if we go back to our Backstage UI, let's refresh the page. And we can see our ArgoCD dashboard here is showing that everything is healthy and synced. Once again, same view we saw in the last video. But now we can go and get our kubeconfig from Achilles. So under vClusters, kubeconfig, and the values here, let's just copy that. And now let's open Visual Studio Code. Back to our preview here for our instructions. And here we'll see how to access the vCluster just like what we did in the last video. So let's clear out of here. Let's type this variable encoded kubeconfig equals, and then the kubeconfig that we got from Achilles, hit enter. Let's copy this line here. And let's export that. And there we go. We are now in the vCluster. We can run commands like kubectl get namespace, kubectl get nodes. Okay, now we want to see how we can access those GPUs. So I have a very short a manifest, Kubernetes manifest with a pod that you can see here. So let's go ahead and apply that, kubectl apply -f, and it's called GPU test.yaml. So that's created. Let's go ahead and run kubectl get all. And I see it's running container creating. So let's run a watch on this. And looks like it is running. That's great. So let's go ahead and see what the logs are showing us. And that's it. It's showing us that we have access to a GPU, which is amazing. You can see here, basically I'm running the command NVIDIA-SMI, and it's showing us the description here. We've got NVIDIA L4 that's available to us. So basically it's showing us that we definitely have access through this pod to a GPU through this vCluster, and therefore you can allow your developers to use vCluster so you can run any application in this pod or any application really in this vCluster to get access to GPUs. So that's fantastic news for your developers. Before I let you go, I want to show you one last thing, and this is our vCluster deploy GitHub action here. I didn't get the chance to show you that particular GitHub action workflow in the past video, so we'll go over this really quickly. You can see the workflow dispatch is on here. Basically, GitHub action is generated by Backstage, so that's why we have it this way. We have a bunch of inputs that we get from Backstage, so this is all fine. Then we got our jobs here, so we got a few steps. And first of all, of course, we're checking out the code. Then we're logging into Achilles. Okay, so just a curl command to log into Achilles here. We have the Achilles access ID and API access key stored in GitHub Actions secrets. There are other ways. I didn't want to spend too much time here for logging into Achilles. There are better ways using a JOT token and so on. But just to keep this demo shorter, we're going to use the API access key method. Then we're installing ArgoCD CLI using this command, logging into ArgoCD, registering the repository in ArgoCD, and then we're getting the DNS ready. As I mentioned previously, this will change depending on how what you're using for DNS, and I'm actually sending some inputs here to this setDNS.sh shell script, which you can find here under Backstage, my Backstage backend templates under vCluster and content and vCluster scripts right here. So you should be able to see the setDNS.sh. So it's grabbing a few inputs from here. Notably, this is the vCluster name, the CF, which is Cloudflare's zone ID token. The target domain that we set, in this case for GKE, was an IP address, the host cluster type. And then from here, it's a script that goes out and creates a DNS record inside of Cloudflare. And depending on whether it's GKE or AKS or EKS, for EKS, it's a CNAME record. For GKE, it's an A type record. And that's it, really. We're creating that record to be able to access the vCluster remotely, okay? So change this according to what domain that you are using. So back to our GitHub action workflow here. Then we're deploying the vCluster, and we're using a Helm command to deploy the vCluster here. So we're adding the loft chart. We're running help repo update. And then depending on, again, whether it's EKS, GKE, or AKS, we're going to use a different destination server that we're getting from the Backstage template that is sending to us. And that's why we made that change in the Backstage template for GKE URL for Argo. And this is done once, really, when you're setting up the vCluster template. So once you've done this once, you don't need to do anything after that for your developers to request new vClusters on the host GKE cluster. And then from here, we're using the ArgoCD app create command to create our application in ArgoCD that will generate our vCluster. So you can see here with the repo that we're referencing, the path, vCluster Helm, and the Helm set command here. I have a couple of them. So we're using the TLS sans. You can see here with the cluster name .tekane.com, and the vCluster syncer extra args here. We're using the kubeconfig server, and again, we're getting this from our inputs .tekane.com. This allows us to access again remotely using that DNS record that we saw before, destination server, that destination server variable that we set from here. And that's it, really. This will create our vCluster for us. Then we need to install kubectl, authenticate with Google Cloud. We need to put our GCP credentials in GitHub Actions. That way we can retrieve the kubeconfig. So here we're setting up Cloud SDK. Then we need to save kubeconfig in Achilles. So we need to, first of all, figure out, are we EKS or GKE? If we're EKS, we're using the export AWS access key ID and secret access key. And again, these would be stored in the secrets within GitHub Actions. From here, we can update the kubeconfig with this AWS EKS command. For our case, for today, we're using GKE. So if we're using GKE, then we're using the gcloud commands that you can see here: component install, container cluster, and you can see that right here. And I haven't done anything with the AKS yet. This is just a placeholder. Let me know in the comments if you really are interested in AKS, and then I'll add it. Also, vCluster kubeconfig base 64 here, we're grabbing that. And from the kubectl get secret, this is actually within the namespace for the vCluster, and it's under the name vc dash and then the actual cluster name. That way we can grab the vCluster kubeconfig base 64. We're echoing it here. And then we're sending a curl request over to Achilles so that we can store that kubeconfig in Achilles. And that's what we did. We went into Achilles, we grabbed the kubeconfig, and we're good to go. And the assumption here is that you would have access or you'd give access to your developers into Achilles, into certain folders in Achilles that they will own. And that kubeconfig will get dropped in that folder where they can access it. And from there, they can have access to their vCluster. To wrap things up, I absolutely love vCluster and use it daily now. So kudos to the Loft team for such an amazing product. Thank you. We saw in this second video how, as platform engineers, we can enable a self-service workflow for our developers that may need access to a Kubernetes cluster with GPUs. We chose GKE as an example and showed how to use Backstage as our internal developer portal, where developers can request a vCluster, and how ArgoCD spins up a vCluster, and within a couple of minutes, the developers can get access to a vCluster with GPUs available. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another video.